Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. I'm Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Holocaust Center's Director of Education. Thank you to our community partners for supporting today's program, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Discovery Center and Unexpected Productions Improv. Thank you also to Michelle Quinones, who is providing closed captioning for us today. I want to start today with a story. Milton Mayer, an American college professor, wanted to find out how ordinary people reacted to Hitler's policies and philosophy. 7 years after the war, he interviewed German men from a cross-section of society. One of them, a college professor, told Mayer the following. This is an excerpt from a longer testimony. The professor said, "But the one great shocking occasion when tens or hundreds of thousands will join with you, never comes. That's the difficulty. If the last and worst act of the whole regime had come immediately after the first and smallest, thousands, yes, millions, would have been sufficiently shocked. If, let us say, the gassing of the Jews in 43 had come immediately after the German firm stickers on the windows of non-Jewish shops in 33, but of course, this isn't the way it happens. In between come all the hundreds of little steps, some of them imperceptible, each of them preparing you not to be shocked by the next. Step C is not so much worse than step B, and if you did not make a stand at step B, why should you at step C? And so on to step D. And one day, too late, your principles, if you were ever sensible of them, all rush in upon you. The burden of self-deception has grown too heavy, and some minor incident, in my case, my little boy, hardly more than a baby, saying Jew swine, collapses it all at once. And you see that everything has changed, and changed completely under your nose. The world you live in, your nation, your people, is not the world you were born in at all. Now you live in a world of hate and fear, and the people who hate and fear do not even know it themselves. When everyone is transformed, no one is transformed. Suddenly it all comes down all at once. You see what you are, what you have done, or more accurately, what you haven't done. For that was all that was required of most of us, that we do nothing. You remember those early meetings of your department in the university when, if one had stood, others would have stood perhaps, but no one stood. A small matter, a matter of hiring this man or that, and you hired this one rather than that. You remember everything now, and your heart breaks. Too late. You are compromised beyond repair. The professor shows us the slow, incremental choices to not act, but turning away is an action in and of itself, and it has consequences. This past week, hundreds of you acted. You raised your voices and supported the Holocaust Center for Humanity in our virtual Voices for Humanity program. Because of all of you who continue to learn, who tune into these programs, who believe in the work we are doing and who put your weight behind it, because of you, this organization is growing and our outreach is having an increased impact. Because of you, we can expand our programming, reach more students, create more resources, and continue to offer these programs and honor the legacy of Holocaust survivors and teach the importance of speaking out and standing up to injustice. The outpouring of support was overwhelming as we surpassed our goal and raised over $1 million at this past year's Voices for Humanity program. You spoke out, your voice mattered, and you are making all of this possible. And don't stop. There is so much to be done, and now is not the time to become complacent. I'm so pleased to have with us today one organization that has been at the forefront of inspiring students, educators, and leaders to create positive social change. Storytellers for Change was founded in 2010 by Luis Ortega. Luis is a multidisciplinary storyteller, empathy educator, facilitator, and the founder and director of Storytellers for Change. Over the last 14 years, Luis has worked with youth, educators, and organizations to co-design storytelling strategies, projects, and programs to foster empathy, inclusion, and equity across communities. His work and projects have been featured at the Harvard DACA seminar, HBO's Where Do You Exist podcast, the Kauffman Foundation Disruptor Speaker Series, and the Art Place America Summit. Most recently, Luis was selected as a W.K. Kellogg Foundation's Community Leadership Network Fellow and has curated the 100 Changemakers project at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Discovery Center. Luis will answer questions at the end of the program. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to type in your questions at any time. Thank you so much, Luis, for being with us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction and story that is so deeply grounding. And hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Luis Ortega. My pronouns are he and him. I am the director and founder at Storytellers for Change, and I'm honored to be able to share a virtual space with all of you. Every time that I engage in one of these presentations nowadays, all of them taking place virtually, I like to start by grounding myself on a couple concepts that are really at the core of today's presentation, but also at the core of the work that I've been doing at Storytellers for Change for the last 10 years, and much longer than that in terms of my personal journey as a storyteller. And for me, that is the concept of radical. What does it mean to be radical? And empathy. What does it mean to be empathetic? And there are many different ways of understanding those two words, but I have a very specific invitation for all of you to think about. And for the context of my presentation, I want you to have a sense for what is it that I mean when I speak each one of these words. When I say radical, I mean really the origin of the word, the root of the word radical actually means root. It's to be connected to our deep roots. And empathy in my practice has three layers. There's introspection, which means really understanding our own thoughts processes, how we form and shape our views of the world, and really reflecting internally so that we are better able to understand self and understanding self-others. Outrospection, which means really thinking about the experiences of others that are outside our realm of awareness, and in doing so, being able to expand our understanding of the world. But there's a third layer, and the third layer is proprioception. And proprioception, if you're not familiar with the concept, is really to have an awareness that extends beyond our physical body. And I know that you know what proprioception is, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples. If you've ever driven a car that you are not used to driving, so you get in that car and you have to build an awareness that you are now driving this machine, really, and you have to have a spatial awareness that now you occupy that whole space. So driving actually requires us to exercise that skill of proprioception. Maybe you've never driven a car, and that's not something that you've done. Another very brief example of proprioception is when you're using a pencil or a pen. It's like it becomes like this object, right? This writing utensil becomes an extension of your body. And that is the ability of proprioception, is just be able to expand our awareness that our body extends farther than it actually does. For me, radical empathy means to be rooted in our sense of self, where we come from. In my case, my ancestors, someone that was born in Tenochtitlan, now known as Mexico City, the ancestral homeland of the Nahua and the Mexica people. It means to be rooted on my identities. It means to be rooted on the history of my mother and my father, and it means to be rooted on my values. And out of that place of being rooted and connected to my sense of self, believing in my worthiness, in my value, in my dignity as a human being, I am able to exercise in true empathy, because I have an awareness of who I am. I have a desire to learn and be connected to others in my life. And I have a desire to expand beyond my own sense of self, to be inclusive of everything and anything that is around me. and to honor it, to respect it, to care for it. That's not how I was taught about empathy as a young kid in school. And part of what I want to tell you today is the story of how I came to develop this understanding of empathy and why I believe that stories are such a powerful mechanism that allows to expand the circle of human concern so that we can have a larger, more expansive we that we care about. In the spirit of being rooted and in the spirit of caring, I also want to briefly start by offering a land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement is a practice through which you honor the indigenous peoples and the indigenous land in which you are. And in a particular context, in this moment, in my office, in the East Lake neighborhood, just a couple blocks away from the Lake Union, I am in the Duwamish and Coast Salish land. And I extend a recognition to the original stewards of this land, this place that now I call home. I recognize that these are their ancestral lands, that they continue to be part of this land, and the future of this land is tied to the destiny of the Duwamish people. I stand in solidarity with the Duwamish people. If you are not familiar with the practice of land acknowledgements, I've asked the organizers of the event to place a link on the chat box that will give you access to a great resource. It's a website called Native Land, and this is a website that was created by a Native-led group based in Canada that offers you the opportunity to see indigenous land in the form of a map. So whenever you travel across this country, across other parts of the world, you can use this map to bring to yourself a sense of awareness of how, before we had nation states, the land already had its own history and its own cultures that over the years, through the displacements of indigenous people, through violence, through genocide, has been slowly removed from our memory. But that is the power of land acknowledgements, because land acknowledgements allow us to remember and to heal our memory, to understand that before there was Seattle, before there was a United States, there was and continues to be a history that is part of this world. And in some ways, a land acknowledgement, it's so connected to the two words that I offer at the beginning, radical and empathy, because we need to be rooted in the true history of the places that we inhabit, so that we can really understand how to take care of them. And we need to be empathetic beyond our concept of self, and bringing that awareness to our lives so that we can truly care for each other. So with that acknowledgement in place, and just with some brief grounding on the words radical and empathy, let me tell you a bit of a different story. Before I became a multidisciplinary storyteller, and long before I became really, in some ways, empathy educator. It's one of the many ways that I describe myself. But long before that, and in some ways, now when I think about it, one of the things that like really speaks to me nowadays is that I come from a family of educators. My mother was an educator, my father's an educator, both of my grandmothers were educators, and I have 7 sisters, and all of them are educators. So nowadays, even though I've never been a classroom teacher, and they very much were classroom teachers, I do consider myself an educator. But my subject matter, it's empathy and it's stories. And my classroom is really anywhere and everywhere I choose to go and be in community with others. But before I realized that this was my calling, I had to go through a handful of, unfortunately, very difficult circumstances and experiences. So my family and I moved to the United States in 2001, very shortly after 9/11. And when I came to this country, I did not speak English. I also did not understand the culture very well, not much more beyond what I had been exposed to in movies and other shows, TV shows. And it was difficult. I was a very introverted kid as well. I was very much always in my head, and it made high school a very lonely experience. The one thing that I do remember very clearly about the first year and a half of my life in this country, so my freshman, sophomore year in high school, is the first time I was able to read a book on my own, completely from beginning to end in English. And I would always, and to this day, I always continuously learning. But I remember back then, I would have to really have a dictionary with me, always Spanish to English dictionary, so that I could translate for myself as I went along through a book. And the first time that I was able to mostly get through a book without consulting that dictionary is when I read Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. And I know that this book it speaks about a very different experience than my own, and has another really important historical context that needs to be examined. And as a freshman and somewhere in high school, I was beginning to understand that history. But that book spoke to me in ways that nothing else had. And it perfectly described how I felt as a high school student, as a human in this country. I am invisible, simply because people refuse to see me. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imaginations. Indeed, everything and anything except me. The first time I read those words, I felt completely understood. I said, that's exactly how I feel. I feel invisible. And to be very honest with you, I was very okay with being invisible, because I felt that to be seen, to be authentically seen in this society, would be something that put me and my family at risk. And for you to understand what I mean by that, I have to tell you another part of my story, which is that when my family and I came to this country, we did so without documents. In other words, I was, and I continue to be, an undocumented immigrant. Now, we know that there are many other words that are used to describe people like me and my family, and that immigration has never been an easy topic to talk about at any point in the history of this country. While we do tend to have a romantic notion around how this country was built by immigrants, the reality, if you spend any time studying history, is that each wave of immigration, each wave of immigrants that have shaped the very diverse nature and unique nature of our cultural fabric as American society, also came with its own stigmas and policies that marginalize and attack these different waves of immigrants. At one point, it was the Irish. Another point, it was the Chinese. Another point, it was the Japanese. Another point, and largely arguably, really for a while now, it's been people that come from places like the one that I come from Mexico, and other parts of South America or Central America, or African countries, or the Middle East. We know that to be an immigrant in this country, especially when you're recently arriving, has never been an easy experience. So I was okay with being invisible. I was okay with being invisible, and my teachers and my peers not knowing about my immigration status. The challenge with being invisible, though, is that at some point, while maybe you feel some safety in not being seen, because you believe that's protecting you in some way, shape, or forms, over time, you start becoming invisible to your own self. You start disconnecting from your own culture. You start feeling shame. You start feeling unworthy. And those were very much feelings that I was struggling with as a high school student. And we know that that age is extremely important in the context of developing a strong sense of identity. When my senior year of high school arrived, I wanted to go to college. After all, that was the one reason why my mom brought us to this country, to pursue higher education, to pursue opportunities, to be able to gain something that my mom knew she couldn't give us in our homeland. The challenge is that as an undocumented kid in high school, I did not know what that process would look like for me. Everything that I had seen thus far in terms of college and applying to college involved me filling out forms that required me to have a social security number. So I went and told my counselor. I decided I've arrived at a point where I can no longer choose to be invisible, because that may also mean choosing to give up on my mom's dream and my dream. So I made an appointment. I went and sat with my counselor, and I asked about college. And as soon as I asked about college, my counselor immediately began to flood me with information. The FAFSA, SATs, and ACTs, and personal statements. She looked at my transcript and she reassured me, you have a really good GPA. You've taken all the right classes. So I'm glad that you're asking this question. Let's get you some help now. Well, I was happy to hear those words. They did not answer my question, really. And that's because I had not given my counselor all the information that she needed to be able to answer my question. So I had to slow her down and say, I actually have another question. I want to know if someone like me can go to college because I don't have papers. Now, the moment I said that, you have to understand that I was full of fear. I was full of anxiety. My heart really felt like it was about to burst out of my chest, and my hands were sweaty. And I was having a difficulty to put my words together. I most definitely have an accent today. Back then, I had an even stronger accent, and what happens to me is that whenever I get really anxious and really fearful, my accent becomes stronger for some reason. And I was just really tripping over my words. My counselor looked very confused. So she asked me for clarification, what do you mean you don't have papers? And then I said to her, I'm illegal. Let me take a deep breath. I've been telling that story for over 15 years now. This happened to me in the fall of 2004. And whenever I tell this story, I'm immediately brought back to the moment, and my body remembers what it felt like to be right there and then, exposed, vulnerable. And then I use that word. I say illegal. And that word, it's beyond hurtful. But I choose to tell it, and I only tell it when I tell this story, because it speaks to an unfortunate and yet powerful truth, that the words we use matter. And that it's entirely possible, while it is not true that human beings are illegal, it is entirely possible to make human beings feel illegal. And what my body remembers when I tell this story is that in that moment, sitting across from my counselor in Roosevelt High School in the fall of 2004, I did not just say I'm illegal, I felt illegal. I felt unworthy. And I use that word to describe myself because, well, that is the word that was being used in the media to describe people like me, to describe my mom, to describe my community. That is the word that I would read in newspaper articles. That is the word that I would hear teachers and students use to describe my community. So it is the word that I use to describe myself. And I was no longer invisible. I was right there, fully exposed. my counselor looked at me very differently as soon as I spoke that word. Was it fear? Was it confusion? I don't know. But I felt a deep sense of disconnection. My counselor went on to tell me that someone like me wouldn't go to college and that I should leave her office now. It was a very heartbreaking moment for me. I left. I did not listen to her advice. I went to college. And as a student at the University of Washington, I really told myself, I'm going to do everything I can to leave that moment behind me, because there was so much pain attached to it. But I couldn't. I just couldn't leave that feeling. I couldn't shake it off. How is it possible that from a moment to the next, someone can go from telling you, I'm here to help you, and then just one word, one more version of yourself is exposed, and suddenly you're not wanted anymore? Why did that happen? In some ways, that experience right there is why years later I started Storytellers for Change. And when I started this organization, I did so with a set of principles, guiding beliefs that are at the core of our practice and the work that we do. And the first one was this, that the stories we tell, as well as the stories we don't tell, shape the cultural fabric and empathetic capacity of communities and organizations. In other words, that the stories that we're exposed to, as well as the stories that we intentionally choose to leave out from our history books, from our national holidays, from our days of observance, from our dialogues and our conversations and our news stories, that anytime that we hide stories, and especially the stories of those who have experienced marginalization, who have experienced inequity, who have experienced racism or xenophobia or homophobia or transphobia, that anytime we leave those stories out, we leave a part of our community out. We leave a part of who we are out. And that shapes what we care about. So the stories that we tell essentially shape our priorities, who matters and who doesn't. So when we say Black Lives Matter, we say Black Lives Matter because we understand that it's time to correct history. It's time to correct how the story has been told about the value, the importance, the need, the moral imperative to ensure that all Black people belong at the center of who we are. And when we say we the people, that they are always included, that their safety is a priority, that their joy is a priority, that their healing is a priority. When we say there is no such thing as an illegal immigrant or an illegal human being, we say that because we know and we understand that immigrants also need to belong in that circle of human concern. So we need to change those stories. John A. Powell from the Other in a Belonging Institute speaks of this concept of the circle of human concern as a way of visualizing this. Through story and through history and through policy, we've created a circle. And inside the circle, there are those that we say matter. These are the lives that we prioritize. And we know if we look through history and our laws in this country, and certainly there's plenty of other examples across the world, we know that the way we conceptualize this nation, when we said we the people, it did not literally mean everyone. It just meant a very specific group, primarily white, male, and affluent. And over the years, it's been the great experiment of American democracy to extend that circle of human concerns to be inclusive of everyone else, that it's part of this country's structure, that is part of this country's future. And yet, what's crucial for us to understand is that we are still far away from realizing this dream. Absolutely, we've made progress, and I am optimistic. And at the same time, I feel pain when I take a close look at who is not in a circle of human concern. When I think about the incarcerated, when I think about those who experience homelessness, when I think about the undocumented community, and as someone who's undocumented and now finds myself in a place of greater privilege because of programs like DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, if you're not familiar with the program, my worry is that we are still creating too many ways through which we keep people out from our circle of concern. And I think part of the reason why we make it so difficult is because we create stories that keep people away from it. When we talk about people experiencing homelessness, do we tell stories that put the blame on the person experiencing homelessness, or that look to actually humanize the person and understand the lack of mental health resources, the lack of affordable housing, the lack of additional comprehensive supports that can help someone move beyond that place of homelessness? When we talk about the incarcerated, do we tell stories that just look at people who find themselves dealing with the criminal justice system, that look at their experiences as through a lens of just punishment? Or are we thinking and talking about people who are in the criminal justice system as people who have also been failed by our system, as people who have not received all the care that they deserve and that they needed to be able to be full participants of our society? These are stories. These are stories that we tell ourselves, and these are stories that we can also change. When I think about what happened to me and my counselor, I like to think about sort of an expanded definition of empathy. And Teresa Wiseman, who's a nursing scholar, spent a lot of time studying people in professions that require them to have a lot of human interaction. So think nurses, think teachers, and really began to and specifically because Teresa Wiseman's argument was, you know, these professions, because they require so much human connection and facilitation, these are perfect professions to study when we think about empathy. And out of those studies, she developed a framework for saying, well, these are the 4 things that I'm seeing in highly empathetic people. Highly empathetic people are people that are able to see the world as others see it. There are people that are able to defer judgment. There are people that are able to understand other person's feelings, and they have the capacity to also communicate those feelings. When I think about what happened with me and my counselor, and I go down this list, I can see that despite my counselor being someone that in other moments in my high school experience, I had felt supported me and helped me, the moment, and let me just go back to sort of this image real quick. I was a student, right? And in the context of my counselor, I as a student belong in the circle of human concern, right? Her job as a counselor is to be there to support me in my academic journey, to help me get to college when I asked this question. But then the word undocumented came into play. And then suddenly, my counselor was not able to empathize with me anymore. Because, and these are assumptions, right? But I'm imagining my counselor was not able to see the world as I saw it. And maybe this was the first time my counselor met someone who was undocumented. My counselor was probably not able to defer judgment in that moment in terms of my immigration status. My counselor was probably not able to fully see and understand my feelings, and certainly could not communicate them back to me. So it's not always that we can be or cannot be empathetic. It's not a question of can or can't. We all as human beings have the capacity to be empathetic. the question is, are we ready to extend that empathy to someone else? And what we know based on empathetic studies is that we're more likely to extend empathy to those who we share a common identity with, or to those that we are familiar with. So there was a dissonance that happened there. Instead of empathy, my counselor experienced apathy. And this separation, right, this lack of awareness or knowledge of someone who has very different experiences than you do is what creates separation in our communities. And I don't mean segregation, although certainly segregation is a way through which you can create separation. And indeed, this country did do that. But the issue is that it's not just segregation that you have to get rid of. The intentional separation of people based on any identifier in the particular case and history of this country. You can look at it in the context of race, you can look at it in the context of gender, you can look at it in the context of disability. It's not just the physical separation, it's the emotional, empathetic separation that exists between people, that you could still have people in very close physical proximity, but emotionally, empathetically separated because of belief systems like a racial hierarchy that still centers and prioritizes whiteness, for example, or still centers and prioritizes just maleness, or prioritizes people who are able-bodied. That sense of hierarchy creates a separation between people. I am better than is the story we've been told. And it's the process through which we begin to dismantle that hierarchy that can help us to bring us closer together at an eye-level playing field where we can authentically see each other's humanity, not as the same, because we are not the same, right? I am not the same as anyone else in this world. The issue is not sameness. The issue is belonging. The issue is that regardless of our differences, regardless of our race, our sexuality, or our histories, that we still belong together, that we still share a human common connection. So how do we get there? Well, I think what's important to understand is that empathy is a journey. Each one of us has to ask ourselves, well, who am I exposed to in my circle of human concern? How do I make myself more aware of the experiences of others? Because the way empathy works is that at first it's an incident, right? You encounter something for the first time, you have a bit of awareness around it. Then it can become a way of knowing. You begin to better understand, well, what are the experiences of people who are immigrants, or people who, in my particular case, are not just immigrants, but undocumented. And then how do you build that as a process of caring and understanding, and they as a way of being? You know, much has happened since, in the context of supporting undocumented students, since this unfolded for me in 2004, where schools now have made more intentional efforts to expand their empathetic concern for undocumented students and families. To be also very honest, there's a lot more that we could do to expand these empathetic concern for undocumented students and families. But the same for any other student and family that experiences any form of marginalization. And this is the lens that we need to bring into our systems and our organizations, so that we can truly better understand how do we care and meet the needs of people who are farthest away from justice. The way I particularly do that in the context of my work at Storytellers for Change is to find, collect, create, and share stories with those who experience inequity or who experience a lack of inclusion, and through those stories bring learning, belonging, connection, and a critical body of wisdom that can help organizations to become more equitable and inclusive. of these communities. I spent a lot of time doing work in the education sector. One of the projects that I worked on with a good colleague, Dominic Mix from Ambassador Stories, was documenting the journeys of first-generation students, and really through understanding what it meant for them to be the first ones in their families to graduate from high school and go to college, and graduate from college, to bring an awareness and an understanding to educators, to administrators, of what it meant to support these students. How do we, through these stories, find the best practices that allow us to better care for them, and to create entire communities that better care for them as a group. And this takes me to the last principle that I want to share with all of you. And with this one, I'll close the presentation, and looking forward to any questions that I could answer. Is that storytelling is the practice of freedom. That owning one narrative is ultimately how we express ourselves. It's the greatest form of expression in self-actualization, and that the true measure of a free, just, and democratic society is a place where all people, regardless of background or experience, are able to fully tell their own stories. Because ultimately, what I deeply believe at Storytellers for Change, and the reason why our mission is to build a more empathetic, inclusive, and equitable world by amplifying historically unheard stories, is that if we begin to pay attention at history and take care of those stories that we've neglected, that we've chained, that we fear, that we've told ourselves are not part of our history, if we start taking care of that piece of our past, then we'll better understand where we are today in society, why we still have disproportionate outcomes across society in terms of well-being, and especially for people who are indigenous, for people who are Black, for other people of color, for people who are queer, for women, for people with different abilities, for immigrants, for refugees, for those that experience poverty, for those that experience homelessness. Those are the stories that have the wisdom, the history, the healing that as a society we so desperately need in this moment. I fundamentally believe that seeing ourselves in each other is what's going to heal us, is what's going to bring us together. And that storytelling, I know for myself, is what has freed me. I am no longer afraid of saying I'm undocumented. I'm no longer afraid of proclaiming my humanity. I'm no longer afraid of anything that has happened or may happen, because I know that I have found myself. And I know that I have the ability to create spaces where we as humanity can come together, see each other, be in solidarity with each other, care for each other, because I've seen it happen. And I so desperately believe in that in this moment, we need to invoke that precious sentiment that is captured in the Mayan language as in Lakesh, which means you are my other me. Or for the Lakota and Dakota people, they have a prayer, Mitakuye o Yasin, or we are all related. Or if you think about the South African philosophy, Ubuntu, I am because we are. This sense of interconnectedness that Dr. King expressed on his letter from Birmingham, that we are all living an everlasting network of mutuality. These are universal truths. Now we just need to choose to tell the stories that would allow us to actualize them, to believe them. And that is our work at Storytellers for Change. Thank you, everyone. And I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Luis. And thank you so much for sharing your personal story and your personal experiences. I want to start by reading one comment that came in, and it says, please thank Luis for his courage to share this so very personal information. I can very well understand the amount of fortitude needed to share something like that in the current political environment. So thank you so much for doing that. There's several questions here. I'm going to choose a few to ask you, and we'll see how many we can get through in the time that we have left. One of them asks, are you doing work with healthcare organizations and individual providers? I see that CMAR Clinics is a partner in your work.
Yes, thank you. I've done some work in the field of health equity. My work actually with CIMAR, which was a few years ago, was with their education department, which they're primarily known, of course, for the incredible work that they do to offer accessible healthcare services to communities. One of their bodies of work also involve doing some really great education work through a program called LEAP, Latino Educational Achievement Project. And it was primarily a program that focused on civic engagement for middle school and high school youth, some college youth as well. And I did some extensive consulting with them on that program. But in terms of health equity, absolutely. I've done some work with community health workers, and how can we, through stories, especially understanding the stories of families that don't have as much access to healthcare services, how can we use those stories to, one, increase the cultural competency and awareness of providers, but also overall the entire system. And then also, how can we, through those stories, build trust between community and community health workers so they can come together and find solutions that provide greater access. So it's just a tiny example of how our work is very cross-sector because we just find that story, it's such a powerful way of just knowing and understanding. And we've been able to apply that strategy to a lot of different spaces, healthcare being one of them.
So another question here, this one comes from Susan, and she writes, how can we calm the fears of friends who are undocumented facing the election's potential outcome of a non-empathetic leader? Thanks for the hope you give and the courage you show.
Thank you for that question. And I'll answer it from my perspective. I think, if I had a friend who wanted to calm my fear, I would say, don't calm it, acknowledge it, right? Be with me in my fear, because I'll speak personally again. I am afraid. But I've been afraid for a lot of years, like deep down, yeah, there's this fear, but it's a fear that by acknowledging it, I can choose to overcome it. And what helps me is to be in community, to be able to know that and to find hope. So the reason why earlier I said that I'm no longer afraid and that I'm hopeful, it's not because the fear's not there, but it's because I found a strong sense of community. I know I'm not alone. I guess it's another way of saying that. So I would say don't calm the fear. Just acknowledge it. Be with people. Let them know, no matter what, we're in this together. And ultimately, let us have hope, and let us act on that hope. Let us organize so that we actually counteract that fear with empathy and with care. And then, of course, right, let's get politically organized so that we can advocate for the policies that bring greater humanity and dignity to all people. So those are just a few thoughts on that, and thank you for the question.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I like what you had to say, that it's not about calming the fear, it's more about acknowledging it and, as you said, getting organized. There's a question here from Claire, and I'm going to make it kind of a two-part question because there's another question that's similar that came in. Claire asks, how does one get an audience that expands the stories to people outside their circle and stays safe? And the second part of that is kind of following up on the principle 2 that you had in your PowerPoint, where you encourage people to tell their stories, especially those groups that are marginalized, but how do we get people to listen to them, and where and how do we tell such stories?
Those are the questions that we ask ourselves all the time at Storytellers for Change. And thank you for them. There's so much complexity to them and layers to them. And I deeply appreciate that. I think the first question you know, early on in my experience, when I started sharing my story very, very publicly, the reality is that uh, I knew that it would expose me. And even though and especially back then when I really, I mean, I was just a student in college, a freshman in college. I did not have a network in terms of people in the community that could support me. My family and I were very much struggling financially. I mean, there were just so many layers of privilege that I've been able to build for myself now that I did not have back then. And it was definitely a risk. And I will never advocate for anyone to share their story that will put them in a place of risk. What I can tell you about my experience and what I can tell you about how we approach doing this work is that we build as much safety as possible in the context of ensuring that someone that's going to be vulnerable with their story feels ready to do so. One, they want to share this story. Two, that the conditions necessary for them to share that story in a way that is safe for them, that protects their identity if needed, that allows them to have psychological and emotional and physical safety, that all of those needs are met. And third, that we will do as much as we can through partnerships with organizations, with organizers, with activists, with anyone in the community that we deem necessary as a partner in the process of sharing that story, so that we can do justice to that act of courage of being vulnerable. Those are things that I've learned over the years to do. When I chose to tell my story and be exposed and be in that place of risk, I did so because of the second principle, that I wanted to feel free. I did not want to hide any aspect of myself. And I remember mentors, I remember colleagues telling me, don't share it or don't say your name. But deep down, I made a very personal choice, and no one else can make that choice but you, that I was ready to live in my full truth. And yeah, like, I mean, there was a fear that came with that, but there was also a great sense of freedom to just be able to actually speak my truth and to just be in that place. It's complex nowadays, right? I mean, and it's always been complex, right? But you look across history and you do see that there comes a time of reckoning in social justice movements when people at first, maybe just a couple, and then eventually a few more, and then eventually a few more, who begin to speak up their truths without any form of shame, but completely emboldened by a sense of community and dignity. And all of that starts at some point with someone that chooses to step into that action. I think we need to intentionally do that in a way that protects us, and also with an awareness and an understanding that not everyone needs to do that. All of us can play different roles in terms of sharing our stories. And there's different ways to do that. Sometimes the most powerful way of sharing your story is not going to be in a place like this, where you could talk to, like, say, for example, like, I think 90 people, right? Or in other spaces where you can speak to, like, even 1,000 people. Like, sometimes the most powerful moments that we're going to have is when we are just sharing with someone else. It's just a one-on-one conversation. And I think it's a very personal choice to determine how ready you are for that, especially if you have an identity that has been marginalized. I think the last thing that I'll say about this, because I could talk about this for a really long time, is make sure that in that moment you feel that sharing that story is going to bring you more healing than any type of hurt. Because a lot of times there will always be a little bit of hurt. Not always, but I'll take that back. There can be sometimes hurt when we share our stories, and I really think early on I would share my story, and it hurt me a lot to share it over and over again, and I was not ready to do it, but I did not know better, and no one coached me through that process. now when I'm working with other storytellers and they're on this process, I always ask them, do you really believe sharing this story at this moment is going to bring you healing? Is it, and that doesn't mean that there's no anger too, or that there's no joy, or that there's no all kinds of other feelings that come here. But at the end of the day, will you walk away from this experience saying, you know what, that is part of my healing process. I'm in that place now with my storytelling. Every story I choose to tell brings me healing. And I think we just need to bring in that perspective to more of our storytelling practices.
So you have to be sure that it's worth the pain and the risk in order to share it, because it comes with that. Like the honesty comes with that.
Yeah,
I mean,
and I think, I mean, the pain and the risk, right? I mean, I think those are external factors when I think about this. Like for me, the pain that I suffer in sharing that story did not originate within me. It came because of a system that has chosen to criminalize people like me, and my family, and many others, who find themselves in so dire situations in their home countries that they have no other option but to immigrate. And I believe that being able to move to thrive as a human being should be a human right. But my family is criminalized for that. So there's that fear that's external. And the risk is also external because it's there. I think the issue is when, if sharing that inside, it's still going to hurt you and you are going to feel dehumanized as speaking those truths. So that's why, like, the layers of empathy, right? Like introspection, outrospection. Like first, like checking with yourself, am I ready to tell that story to myself? Then second, am I ready to share those stories with others? Then third, am I ready to share that story beyond the space that I'm immediately a part of? And I think that helps to sort of think of those layers.
Luis, this is so powerful, and I'm sorry we're just about out of time, but I want to ask you like one final question for just a relatively short answer, and that is, what strategies or resources would you suggest for educators and teachers to encourage empathy in the classroom?
Yes, absolutely. So there's a few, but I'll name my favorite ones. So Rethinking Schools, it's an amazing organization led by educators of color, and they have a handful of different resources of teaching for Black Lives Matter, teaching for environmental justice, teaching for disability justice, teaching for queer justice, and I think bringing in a curriculum that is justice driven, developed by and for communities of color, but with a lens that's inclusive and empathetic of all of us. It's needed. I think, so I would just say anything Rethinking Schools, I highly recommend, because I think a lot of times, like the word empathy, we don't always have to say it when we teach empathy. Sometimes just teaching a history that we know has been intentionally left out, it's empathy. It's teaching empathy. It's bringing in awareness to something new and different. Teaching Tolerance, amazing resource, lots of amazing lesson plans in that website for educators as well. And then I'm really gonna say, even though this is targeted for like a different audience with a little bit of adaptation, I think, and I know educators are amazing at adapting things to bring them into their curriculum. I am going to recommend the Institute for Othering and Belonging, which I mentioned John A. Powell earlier. And there's a couple of explainer videos and some curriculum in that website that, again, their target audience is really, you know, I mean, they're like an academic research institution and policy institution. So they have like, they did not design these videos and curriculum thinking about students, but the concepts in there are so powerful and I believe easily adaptable, I think, to a classroom, easily middle school or high school classroom. So those will be the three that I'll recommend.
That's great. That's great. Thank you so much. Those are excellent resources. And just to everyone who's tuning in today, Storytellers for Change also does work with students and educators and workshops and has educational programming, and you can find all that on their website as well. You can also see a video in the short documentary that Luis referenced earlier. You can find all that information on their website. Luis, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your personal story and inspiring us and challenging us to do more. Really appreciate it. I also want to thank our community partners for supporting today's program, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Discovery Center and Unexpected Productions Improv. This program has been recorded and you can find it on our website starting tomorrow, along with all of our other past Lunch and Learn presentations. It takes a dedicated team to keep the Holocaust Center running at full speed with virtual presentations like this one and presentations from our Speakers Bureau, professional development for teachers, creating online resources, book discussion groups, the Student Leadership Board, and so much more. And I want to thank our entire staff, Richard Green, who's doing the technical side of this production behind the scenes, and also a huge thank you to our Executive Director, Dee Simon, and our entire team, Nicole Bella, Lori Rochelle-Cohen, Julia Thompson, Paul Regelbrug, Rosa Campos, Sydney Draytel, Ellie Selesky, Amanda Davis, and Katie Lawrence. Be sure to join us next week for the first in our series of 3 programs on America and the Holocaust, offered in partnership with the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Program and the Kurt Mayer Chair of Holocaust Studies at Pacific Lutheran University. And thank you to our supporter, the Powell Family Foundation, for making this next series of 3 presentations possible. Next Tuesday, we feature Dr. John McManus, who's a military historian and author of Hell Before Their Very Eyes, in which he sheds new light on the experiences of American soldiers who liberated or witnessed concentration camps. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us today, and we hope to see you back here next Tuesday. Thanks a lot.